Hello everyone, my name is Cody Clift and I'm here to give my book talk presentation on a little gem you may have heard of called Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Let's go ahead and jump right in, shall we? So, a little bit about William Golding. He was born in England on 1911 and he died at the ripe old age of 81 years old. What people will find really interesting about him is this was actually his very, very first novel that he ever published. He tried his hand at poetry for a little while, but it didn't really work out well. He was teaching at the time, and eventually he had this little book idea, and he took it to several publishers, and they all rejected him one after the other, as is typical in the story of authors and their works. Until he came across this one editor who really liked it, and together they put this book together, and it just flew off the shelves for its time, which was 1954. And another thing that you'll find really interesting is he only ever published around 14 other novels and around 5 short stories. He was not a very productive author in the grand scheme of things, but despite that, as you can see there clearly, he won a Nobel Prize for his literature. This guy was all about quality over quantity, as you can see. And another thing about him that I really wanted to point out is when he married his wife, Anne Brookfield, in 1939, he stayed with her for decades upon decades upon decades. And when you read a lot of stories about authors, you kind of notice that their backstories always tend out to be really, really tragic, especially when it comes to the romantic front. And seeing something like that really impresses me. You know, one of my favorite authors is Joseph Conrad, and, you know, his romantic life was a travesty. and so, you know, seeing something like that just makes me happy. But enough about that, and let's actually get to the book itself. So, what is The Lord of the Flies about? Well, the gist of it is a bunch of kids are being flown over the Pacific Ocean, and their plane crashes on this deserted island. They quickly realize that there are no adults here to supervise them. They are all on their own. There's no guardians, no parents, no nothing. Pure freedom. And at first, everything is nice and lawful and orderly. You know, they have a plan. They're going to start setting fire to try and signal out to, to get help. They have a way of communicating with each other with the conch. They can create fire using, the glasses of Simon. And everything is nice and going pretty swell. Until the general gist of chaos starts seeping in. The paranoia, the thirst for power, that same greedy horribleness that affects adults also affects children. And you'll see through subtle, deathful allusions to the war that is happening around them that what is happening on this island is more or less mirroring what is happening in the real world, that us adults aren't that different from children. You know, we're not that different from savages, which, you know, ironically speaking of Joseph Conrad in his book Heart of Darkness, you'll kind of see the same themes of when you take the sunlight away, you know, what do people become when the eyes of society aren't looking upon them? And you'll see a lot of that with a character named Jack especially, as he gives in to that chaos, that thirst for power, and basically takes everything out of control. Eventually, though, they are rescued by a Navy captain and his little team of men, and the whole weight of all the evil that happened on this island finally settles in, and they realize that, you know, the main character was right, in a sense. Though I'd argue that if the chaos that happened on the island, which ultimately resulted in a huge cataclysmic fire where they tried to burn down the island didn't happen. They might not have been rescued. But I think that's a different argument altogether. Regardless, upon realizing what happened, all the children start crying. Which isn't exactly a high point, but I like to point out the moral specifics of that scene in particular. So to move on. So who are the main characters? Well, the first thing you need to know about the main characters is they are all tools to an extent of moving the plot and spreading the message of the story, which I kind of jumped on. The main character, of course, is Ralph. He is kind of the moral balance of the story. He is the person you kind of look through the eyes of. While the story has a third-person narrative, it really does focus on Ralph as the primary character, though it does, of course, jump to Piggy and Simon and a few of the others. The other main character, I'd say, would be Jack, and he's kind of the main antagonist, but in a sense, he's kind of a mirror of our own carnal desires, in a sense. You know, he is just wanting to survive, and that takes him to such a high level, this bloodthirsty general thirst of power that overtakes him, and it gets real dirty, and it's the conflict between these two characters that ultimately drives the children apart from each other, and that little seeping of chaos that was so small in the beginning eventually erupts into that cataclysmic fire I talked about earlier. And the side characters are all very important, but when I say a character in this book especially are tools, they're a little bit more specific. Piggy, Simon, Roger, Sam, and Eric, and a few others. They all have a very specific purpose, roughly one or two, that they bring to the plot. And they're just so crisp and cleanly put in there and put out just as fast as they came. And that's something I really admire about this book. But a character I didn't fit in this page that I really want to talk about is the Beast. And now, when I talk about a character that's called the Beast, no one really... I would assume that most people would assume you're talking about a monster. But the Beast in this story isn't so much an actual monster, so much as a figment of the children's blind imagination that further drives them to be crazy. But I'll get into the Beast a little bit later. So what are the themes of the story? Well, the main two is law versus chaos, and you see I have a little bit of quotes from the story that I think really kind of show these themes in action, and the other is civilization. The idea of can we really keep our savage nature at bay? Is sunlight the best disinfectant? Law versus chaos is kind of self-explanatory. You have people trying to keep order, and then you have people going crazy and having tribal rituals to try to scare away a imaginary monster. That, of course, turns out to be just a dead soldier. But another minor theme is the individual versus the group. Ralph and Piggy and Simon especially, these are characters that really stick to their ideals and the principles throughout the story when all the others kind of give in and begin to torment them for it. So, I guess in the end, did I like this book? Well, yes, I really did. I love this book. It's my first time really going through it. I pecked at it a little bit in high school, mostly because it was there, but I never got to really read it. And it really blew my socks off. I was not expecting it to be so dark and so dreary, but at the same time, so enjoyable at the same time. And it does have an optimisticness to it that I really admire in my books. Typically, these books, especially nowadays, just take a downhill and they never get back up. So I really appreciated this book. Moving on. So what about the writing style of William Golding? Well, I really like it. And I don't mean to be mean when I say this, but a lot of British authors, the stereotype, they tend to go two ways. The first way is to be really long and drawn out and dreary and really sad. And if that's what you like, that's okay. It's not my thing. But the other style is actually my favorite style. And it's why just about all my favorite authors are British, which is this crisp and passion-filled writing style where not a sentence is wasted. Everything is just happening one after the other. One sentence leads to another. And this book is really the former. It is just the latter is just a breathtakingly well-written story. And the symbolism is marvelous. And I'd say Lord of the Flies is probably the best book when it comes to symbolism. And I say that in full regards of its competitors like The Great Gatsby. I think Lord of the Flies just blows them out of the water. Though I will say they are a little bit more over the head in a bludgeoning sense. Some of the symbolism isn't going to be missed. All right. So, would I recommend this book? Excuse me. The answer is absolutely. To compare it to a few of the books we read during this class, like the Hunger Games and the Graveyard Book, I think those are the two it has the most in common with. I choose the Hunger Games just because if you're kind of desensitized to the idea of kids fighting each other and killing each other, and you want to give something similar a whirl, this book is probably perfect for you in a really dark way. But it's also got a few horror elements that really, really sink into the book, and while the Graveyard Book was by no means a horror book, it had those elements, and if you're like those elements and you want to see them explored further, then I would really recommend this book. And I probably wouldn't recommend it for anyone ages 12 and up, and that's self-explanatory. So, a few questions that I would ask someone who just read this book is, can you imagine a world that had completely given in to this chaos? What is the beast? What is the beast of the modern world? What is it that we hold to such a high regard, but it doesn't exist, and it's tearing us all apart? How does this correlate? How do these children just correlate with the adult world in general, really? All right. And here's my works cited. Thank you very much for watching this little video. I apologize that my camera work was absolutely terrible. This is the best I could do. Regardless, it's been a pleasure, and I wish you all a very blessed day.